Hello there. That was a short introduction. I have been doing this for 25 years, and I've never just been introduced. This is Jay Winik. I expect them to pump me up a little bit. Anyway, it's great to see you. I'm going to talk about my book, April 1865, today, and then if we have a little bit of time, we'll do some Q&A afterwards. And with that, let me just tell you one thing about the readers for this book are wide and varied, and I just want to give you a little bit of background on this. The book, when it first came out, it was a New York Times #1 bestseller, and it really just kind of took off. And so I've got, as fans of my book, I have everyone from George Bush and Bill Clinton to Chief Justice John Roberts to most of the Supreme Court, a good brunt of the Senate, and more recently, Tom Hanks told the New York Times that this is one of his favorite books, and so it's got a good, broad, and diverse readership. But anyway, I'm thrilled to be here in Rancho Mirage, notwithstanding my two-word introduction. And let's just get into the book and let's have a little bit of fun. Throughout history, most civil wars have ended quite badly, with more bloodshed, more turmoil, and more carnage. Think of Iraq, think of Afghanistan, think of Syria, or think of Vietnam in an earlier time period. Well, our Civil War could have ended just as badly, with more carnage, more bloodshed, more turmoil, and more mayhem. But it didn't. Why? April 1865 answers that question. Now, to think about this, I want to take you to an important meeting before April 1865. The meeting takes place in March of 1865, and Abraham Lincoln convenes his two top generals, U.S. Grant and Bill Sherman, and he wanted to talk about the war, when it will end, how it will end, and what was finally to happen when it does end. And he looked over to Grant and he looked over to Sherman, and Lincoln wanted to talk about something that had been giving him headaches, that had been keeping him up at night, that had been making him sick with worry. And he says to his two top generals, he said, "Lee being Lee, must more blood be shed? Must there be a final bloody Armageddon?" And Grant shakes his head very sadly, and he says, "Yes, Lee being Lee, more blood will be shed. There will be a final bloody Armageddon." And then Lincoln wants to talk about something else that had been keeping him awake at night, that had been giving him fits, that had been making him worry sick, and giving him these migraines that he was being plagued with. And that was, as he put it to his two top generals, he said he was worried about the Confederates taking to the hills with, as he put it, their hardy horses and hardy men, and then wage, in effect, what would be a guerrilla war. And once more, Sherman and Grant look over to the president, and they say, "Yes, Lee being Lee, we too are worried about that." And then there's one other thing that Lincoln wanted to talk about in this meeting at City Point. It was one of his most visionary, one of his most significant moments in the entirety of the war, in the entirety of his presidency. And that was, as he put it, he said to General Sherman and General Grant, he said, "You know, when this war is over, there must be no bloody work, there must be no hangings, there must be none of that." In other words, what he was talking about is what was on the minds of so many Americans in that day and age. And that was the bloody specter of the French Revolution, in which the carnage continued on and on and on. And in effect, what Lincoln was saying is that must not be repeated here. We must have a just peace, we must have a soft peace, we must have a tender peace. So, if those were Lincoln's plans, however, on the other side, on the Confederate side, General Robert E. Lee had his set of plans. What he wanted to do, as he put it, was he wanted to hook up with General Joe Johnston down south and then strike out at all people Bill Sherman. And as he put it at the time, he said, "We must be prepared to fight to the death." And of course, fighting to the death was exactly everything that Lincoln was worried about. But as I said, Lee had his set of plans. His armies were now in Petersburg and Richmond, and there were some 37,000 people. And then eventually they left Richmond, they left Petersburg, and they were retreating down south to hook up with Joe Johnston in 5 long snaking lines, each of these lines being some 37 miles each. And then for this retreat to be successful, all Lee had to do was one thing. He had to make his way to a little place called Amelia Courthouse, where train cars would be waiting for him, and in those train cars would be precious cargo. And that precious cargo would be food, it would be water, it would be tea. Because when they abandoned Richmond, and when they abandoned Petersburg, they had weapons, they had guns, they had caissons, they had everything but food, they had everything but water. So, hour after hour, day after day, in the hot Virginia heat, they were retreating. These long lines of snaking men and weapons and material. And eventually they find Amelia Courthouse. And Lee is on his famous horse Traveler. And as he sees the train in the distance, he spurs his horse forward and he gallops down to the train tracks. And he opens up the boxcar and he looks through to see what's there, to inspect this precious cargo. And well, what was there was guns. What was there was bullets. What was there was ammunition and caissons. Everything was there but food. Everything was there but water. Everything was there but tea. So in other words, a mere administrative mix-up has threatened to undo this mighty rebel army of Northern Virginia than any of the northern armies before then. Lee had a careworn look on his face. He looked shocked and he looked stunned. Yet nonetheless he resolved, we will continue this fight and we will continue it with great spirit even still. So he would continue his retreat, and as he continued his retreat, which was often compared to a death march because they had so little food, yet they continued it with great spirit. But at the same time as this was happening, I want you to picture another scene taking place. In Richmond, remember what Richmond is, Richmond, Virginia. Richmond as the capital of Virginia, Virginia as the birthplace and the mother of so many of the great early presidents, and Richmond was up in flames, burning, literally out of control. If you looked down this way to see where your local neighbor was, you couldn't figure out where he was. If you looked this way to see where your family lived, you couldn't figure out where your family lived. If you looked this way to figure out where your grocer was, you wouldn't be able to figure that out because Richmond was burning out of control. But what was happening into this terrible carnage, this terrible flaming Richmond? Well, what would take place would be one of the most poignant scenes, not only of the war, but perhaps of human history. Abraham Lincoln, the United States president, he had decided he wanted to see the now fallen rebel capital, and he wanted to see it with his own eyes. So he goes in a small little ship. He disembarks at a place called Rocket's Landing, and as he disembarks, and of course there are quite great concerns about security for him, all of a sudden he's mobbed by a sea of faces, mobbed by a sea of black faces, mobbed by a sea of former slaves who were now free, who just wanted to get a look at their Redeemer. Imagine how poignant, imagine how powerful that was. Well, when they wanted to see Lincoln, they wanted to brush him, they wanted to touch him, and at one point a man shouts out, "Glory, glory to God, glory, glory to God." And then another man throws himself at Lincoln's feet. And Lincoln looks at him and he wags a stern finger and he says, "You do not kneel to me. From now on, you kneel only to your God. You kneel only to your Creator." Imagine how powerful that was. And then Lincoln declares, okay, now I want to go see the Confederate White House. It's hot. He's tired. He walks a part of the way, then he rides the rest of the way. And eventually he makes his way to the Confederate White House. And once there, he goes from room to room to room until he goes to Jefferson Davis's office. And when he's in Jefferson Davis's office, just recently departed just hours before by the Confederate president, Lincoln sits in Jeff Davis's chair. And as he sits in that chair, all his men begin shouting and screaming, "Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah." And then eventually Lincoln says, "My God, I thought I'd never live to see this moment. I never thought I would get here." And once more they began cheering. So imagine just how poignant and powerful that was. But anyway, so if Lincoln was doing this in Richmond, I want you to remember what's happening with Lee and his troops. They're still retreating down south. They fight against the North in a bitter battle at Sailor's Creek, where they fight with just an incredible amount of tenacity. And at one point, several of the top aides to General Lee go over to him, and they talk about the most dreaded word in the entire Confederate vocabulary. And that dreaded word was the word surrender. And Lee looks at them and he thunders very coldly. He says, "What? Surrender? No, our men fight far too bravely ever to think of surrender." And at that point, they continued their retreat. But by the morning of April 9th, it's clear that Lee's army is surrounded. They're surrounded on the east side. They're surrounded on the west side. They're surrounded on the south side. The only direction they can go in is north, the only direction he doesn't want to go in. And it's at that point that he calls for a council of war. Now they're tired, they're hungry, they're worn out. They all sit down by a little tree, a tree that by the end of the day would be just peeled away by every Confederate because they knew history was being made here and they all wanted a piece of it. And one by one they would peel off all the bark on the tree. But anyway, they kneel down and they sit by this tree. And E. Porter Alexander, who was one of the Confederate heroes at the Battle of Gettysburg, goes to General Lee and he says, "General, you know, a little more bloodshed now makes no difference. We can scatter into the hills like rabbits and partridges." In other words, what Alexander was talking about with General Lee was guerrilla warfare. In other words, what he was talking about is that the hardy men and the hardy horses of the South take to the hills and continue this war on and on and on. And of course, the first thing for Lee to think about was, could he have done it? Well, he had the men, they had the writers, they had the fighters, they had the temperament, and indeed, if they had waged guerrilla warfare, they would have been one of the most formidable guerrilla armies in all of human history. So there's one other thing that Lee wanted to think about as he considered this possibility of waging guerrilla war, and that was what was taking place in Missouri. For in Missouri, already what was taking place was a guerrilla war that in terms of its scope and savagery rivals anything that we've seen anywhere around the world today. It was not uncommon for riders to be riding around with scalps, human scalps from their enemies that they had just cut off, or limbs hanging from their horses. It had totally broken down in Missouri, and that was the other thing that Lee had to think about. So, Lee sighs, he pauses, he waits, and then in almost a little whisper, he says, "We can't do this." He says, "It's too much for the country. We can't wage guerrilla warfare. We won't wage guerrilla warfare." And at that point, he straightened himself up, and he said, "And now I must go meet General Grant, and I will surely be his prisoner today." So, if this is, in effect, one of Lee's finest moments in the entirety of the war, in the entirety of his life. So as he's riding along to go meet General Grant, he's wearing, as I said, his finest uniform, because as he said, he will be a prisoner on that day. And uncharacteristically, he's speaking in mumbled and jumbled half sentences. It turns out that this fearless general, Robert E. Lee, is actually concerned. He's actually scared, because he knew that throughout history, defeated rebels had repeatedly been beheaded. They had been hung. They had been imprisoned, or like General Napoleon, they had been exiled. So he wondered, how would he be treated on that day? Well, how would he be treated on that day? Well, we do know on that day, the Vice President Andrew Johnson in Washington, D.C., gave a rousing speech in which he said, "Hang Davis, hang Lee, hang them 20 times." And the crowd began cheering and cheering and cheering. And we also know that on the same day in the Chicago Tribune, they too wrote an editorial, "Hang Lee, hang him 20 times." So as Lee was riding along, he would go to a little place called Appomattox, a sleepy little village with a few houses and a few structures, and the Wilbur McLean house, a house that ironically was there at the first battle of the war, and now it would be the setting for the surrender at the last major battle of the war. And Lee would walk into the Wilbur McLean house, the designated setting for the surrender, and as I said, he was wearing his finest uniform, and then no one else was there. He waited for 10 minutes and 15 and 20 minutes, and eventually U.S. Grant comes in, and he's wearing a mud-spattered private's blouse. And think about that. Nothing could be more vintage American, more vintage Grant than what Grant was doing there. And so Grant comes in, a few aides come in, and in the beginning, they don't talk about the surrender. They don't talk about the war. They don't talk about the fighting. They don't talk about the men. What they do is they reminisce. They talk about the old days, when they knew each other, when the two sides were friends. And Grant, who was actually kind of in awe at looking at the great General Robert E. Lee, he says, "You know, General, I remember you from the Mexican War." And so they talked amiably for a few more minutes, and then eventually, with a sigh, Lee looks over to Grant and he says, "Well, sir, I suppose we should talk about why we're here, the question of surrender." And at that point, in a kind of rapid clip speech, Grant says, "Okay, very well then, let's talk about the surrender." And in this, Grant is thinking about the things that were said to him by General Lee by Abraham Lincoln at the meeting at City Point. And he does several important, several quite profound things. One of the first things he does is he says to General Lee, that you can keep your horses. Now think about this. If you're worried about the South waging guerrilla warfare, the last thing you want them to have is their horses. But as he said, you will need to plant a little crop. And he was also saying quite loudly and quite forcefully and quite clearly is we may have defeated you, but we honor you. We may have defeated you, but we are to become brothers again. And then he does something else quite important. He allows the defeated rebels to keep their sidearms. Again, this makes no sense if you're worried about them waging guerrilla warfare, but he was saying once more, loudly and clearly and forcefully, is we may have defeated you, but we honor you. We are to become brothers once more. And then the most important thing of all that Grant does takes place in a few minutes. But first, the surrender documents are signed, and Lee shakes the hand of every man in this little Wilbur McLean house, one after another after another. And then the final man is a Seneca Indian. And he looks over to the Indian, he shakes his hand, and he says, "Thank God we have one real American here." And the Indian looks back at General Lee, and he says, "General, we are all Americans here." And then at that point, Lee walks out onto the steps of the Wilbur McLean house, and it turns out in the hills and in the mountains surrounding them are men in the thousands, all standing at rapt attention to see what would happen next, to see about this historic peace that was about to emerge. And anyway, so Lee looks over, he surveys the surroundings, then he walks down the steps. He goes one step, a second step, and a third step, and it puts him on the ground. And as he goes onto the ground, he goes over to his horse Traveler that was brought around for him, and he gets on Traveler. And as he gets on him, he sort of shrugs his shoulders, and he sighs, just like that. And as he did that, everybody tensed, wondering, okay, what would happen now in this dramatic piece of theater? And what would happen now in this dramatic piece of theater of the surrender is that Grant would come out, and it would be his boldest stroke yet of all. In front of all his men, in front of all his officers, to send a signal to all of the United States at large, as well as to the South. He looks over to Lee, and he takes his hat, and he tips it to honor Lee as a fallen foe. And he does that in front of all his men. And then Lee sort of rides off into the sunset, as it were. Now, I want to remind you of one thing. When Lee surrenders, he surrenders only his army. There are still 3 Confederate armies in the field, their gun barrels hot to the bitter end. There are still 175,000 men waiting and ready to continue the fight. There is still Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, calling on the South to wage guerrilla warfare. And there is even Mary Lee, Robert E. Lee's wife, the direct descendant of Martha Washington, who says Richmond is not the Confederacy, Lee is not the Confederacy. In other words, she was talking about continuing the fight even still. So the question is how much longer would this war last? A week? A month? 6 months? A year? Well, such time spans have been enough to reverse and unseat great dynasties, to change the outcomes of wars, or to complicate the reconciliation to come. And indeed, that's exactly what would happen in just a few short days. 5 days later, after the surrender of Appomattox, 3 deadly assassins would fan out. Imagine what happens. These deadly assassins fan out. The first one goes into a place called Ford's Theater, where President Lincoln is watching a comedy to keep him amused, and it's John Wilkes Booth, and he fires at him and shoots him in the head, and by 7:22 the next morning, the great Abraham Lincoln is dead. Then there's a second deadly assassin who fans out also at the same time at night at 10:15, and he finds William Seward, the Secretary of State, and he stabs him not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 5 times. And Seward, by only a quirk of luck, he's still alive, but his life is hanging in the balance. And then there was a third deadly assassin that was going to assassinate Andrew Johnson, the vice president. But only at the last second does this assassin get cold feet, so Johnson actually survives. But picture, if you will, and put yourself in the minds and in the hearts of the United States at this point. This was their 9/11 of the day. They were terrified. They were horrified. They didn't know what would happen next. They didn't know what kind of carnage was around the bend. And as the Chief Justice put it at the time, he said it was a night of horrors. And indeed, it was a night of horrors. And indeed, there was such confusion and such concern and such chaos that the United States cabinet actually thought a Napoleonic coup was underway. And who do they think was behind this Napoleonic coup? Well, not a Southerner, not Jefferson Davis, but their own great general, Bill Sherman. They thought he was behind it. So in other words, it was just turmoil and craziness and chaos all across the board. So the question was, what would happen next? Well, what would happen next is the question would be raised, would all this carnage come to define the peace to come? Would everything all come undone? And in fact, everything would not all come undone. What would happen is that once more, Robert E. Lee would step forward on the stage. And as he would step forward on the stage, he would write a letter to Jefferson Davis. And in this letter, he said, "Do not wage guerrilla warfare. It cannot be won, and even if it could be won, it should not be fought. It would be too much." And as he was writing this, remember, the question now is who would the Southerners listen to? Would they listen to General Robert E. Lee, or would they listen to their president, Jefferson Davis, who was on the run, calling for guerrilla warfare? Well, as one man said to Robert E. Lee when he went to go talk to him about something else, and Lee just sort of hemmed and hawed and said, well, he wasn't sure what to do about that incident. And this man looks over to Lee and he says, "But General, you are the country to these men." So in other words, these men, the men of the South, the Confederate soldiers, they were listening more to Lee than they were to Davis. And Lee had said, don't wage guerrilla warfare. And then Lee did something else kind of quite significant. He gave an interview to the New York Herald Tribune, to Thomas Cook. And in this interview, he said, the best men of the South have long wanted to be rid of slavery. And he said he rejoiced at the end of slavery. And then another thing he talked about once more is we will not wage guerrilla warfare. And he will do everything in his power to ensure that that happens. And then he did something else quite significant. He talked about what we in the country are to do next. Now, why is this so significant? Well, imagine this. Think about this. Just days before when he said we, he meant the Confederacy. Just days before when he said the country, he meant the South. And now he is freely speaking as a citizen of the United States and calling on all other Southerners to become good citizens of the United States. And of course he was doing this even though in a short-lived life that he would have of 5 more years, he would not and would never again become a citizen of the United States. And then Lee would do something else quite significant. One day in Richmond, he would go and he would be taking services in St. Paul's Church. St. Paul's Church was the church for the high and the mighty and the well-to-do and the elite of Richmond. And at one point during this church service, something quite amazing happened, something really unthought about, unheard of, never before contemplated. Well, communion was about to begin, and as communion was about to begin, a black man was in the church, and he made his way up to the chancel rail, and he kneels down to take communion. And everybody tensed. Nobody knew what to do. This was literally the heavens turned upside down in Richmond. The heavens turned upside down in the South. Well, all of a sudden, a man who didn't look very healthy, he didn't look very well. He had lost his hair, and what hair he had turned totally white, and his face was lined and creased, and he looked overweight, and he didn't move with a very good gait. He looked a little unsteady. And that man sort of went one step after another, walked all the way up right next to the black man at the chancel rail, and he took communion with him. Well, who was that man? That was Robert E. Lee. So Lee was doing his part to bring the country together. And of course, the Union generals, both Bill Sherman and Grant, had done everything they could to carry out Lincoln's wishes. So, in other words, they were trying to set a tone. What we see in the end is that April 1865 is a story of great leadership. April 1865 is a story of 1 month. April 1865 is a story of a man who never became a citizen again, but called for there to be reconciliation. April 1865 is a story of our greatest president that this country's ever had, of Abraham Lincoln, who gave his life for it. April 1865 ultimately is not a story of war, it's a story of peace. That's the story of April 1865. Thank you. And now I'm going to take a few questions if any of you have questions. Yes, ma'am.
Why did he not become a citizen?
Why? The question is why did Lee not become a citizen? Is because they didn't make him one. They kept him in this kind of paroled status. And indeed, at one point with Lee, They actually tried to indict him, and Grant said, if you do that, I will never allow it. So, but there was a real dance going back and forth. And what Lee did was is he became the head of what is now called Washington Lee. He wanted to be an educator, and he wanted to educate young men of the South as a way of becoming part of a new economy in a new country. He was really looking forward. It was quite significant. Yes, ma'am.
To your knowledge, how many people did go to the hills? Was there much guerrilla warfare after it was all said?
Yeah, her question is to my knowledge, how many people went to the hills and was there guerrilla warfare? Think about this for a second. With the Israelis and the Palestinians under the days of Arafat, think of how Arafat would talk peace with one hand, and then with a wink and a nod, they would continue terrorism. Well, if Lee had played those games, it would have been so easy for Lee to say, we're not going to wage guerrilla warfare. But then when people went to go see him, and they said, we're thinking of taking to the hills, and all he had to do was give a wink or give a nod or just not say anything terribly significant, well, then we'd probably be living in two countries today. The answer is not many people did it. At one point, John Mosby, of the great Mosby Raiders fame, came to him and said, what do you want us to do? Do you want me to take my men? Do you want me to go to the hills? We can continue this. And Lee said, don't do it. And then even Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, whose name is considered toxic in many quarters today because he was the first head of the Ku Klux Klan. Well, he actually quit the Ku Klux Klan because he thought it was becoming so radical. But he had started out the war as a private, and he rose from being a private to being a general, a rise that was further than anyone in the South, anyone in the North. And he was really one of the most feared and one of the most dreaded riders. And he really never lost a battle in the entirety of the war. And my God, if there were anyone who was suited to carry out guerrilla war, it would have been Nathan Bedford Forrest. And at one point, as he was thinking about what to do near the end of the war, he came to a fork in the road, and one fork went this way, the other fork went that way. And he said, my God, if these roads led to hell, I'd still take you there, my men. But even he listened to General Lee. Now, the only person, or the only set of people who basically didn't listen, well, we know them as the Jesse James boys. Yes, sir.
Why did they think that General Sherman was having a coup?
The question is why did they think General Sherman was having a coup? And it just shows, I think, more than anything else, a kind of chaos and lack of clarity about what was taking place. And I think they probably thought Sherman was behind it, is because Sherman, even though he waged a hard, terrible, tough war in the South, as he put it, he went some 450 miles and he burned one city after another. Or as he put it, I burned it and I burned it good. Or as he later put it, when he took Savannah and burned that as well, and he sent a little jaunty note to Abraham Lincoln, and he said, I beg to present you a gift for Christmas, the gift of Savannah. So, I mean, he waged a very tough kind of war, as he put it, the hard hand of war, so the South would never again resort to war. But having said that, he actually loved the South. He loved Southerners. He had great fondness and affection for it, and he hated to do what he did. He did what he had to do because he knew it was right to win the war for the United States. But why did they think he was behind it? We don't know for certain, but we do know that that's what they thought. Yes, sir.
There was a story after the surrender that the Union troops moved in with food and water and served actually is that myth or is that true?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. The question is that there was a story that after the surrender that they brought in food and water for the Southerners. And remember what the Southerners were like at this point. Lee left Richmond, he left Petersburg, they did this retreat, they did it in really kind of great heat, and the men were exhausted. They were literally eating bark off of trees. They were so hungry, or they were eating what probably were near poisonous berries. I know we certainly wouldn't want those berries in our diet, but anything they could get their hands on, and they were foraging in desperation for food. They were emaciated, they were thin, they were tired. Their teeth were coming out, their hair was falling out. They were really unhealthy because they had had so little food, and yet they were marching and fighting and marching and fighting. And once more, to the credit of Grant and to the credit of the other Union commanders, they found food and they were passing it out and distributing it. And all these became part of, but not, I don't want to say legend or myth, they became powerful symbols to take to the South for the Southerners to be told, let's become one again. Because one of the things I need for all of you to know and to remember and to think about is just the kind of hatreds that existed between the two sides during the war. I mean, these were two sides who went at it with everything they could have. They killed each other, they shot each other, they murdered each other. And, you know, as Mary Chestnut, who we now know as the great Southern diarist, and she was certainly no hater, she wrote in her diary, she said, oh, these Northerners, they're like red ants, they're like locusts, they're like the plagues of Egypt. Oh, I hate them so. So in other words, these hatreds were really vast. I mean, if your home had been raided and they had come and just burned your farms and torched everything in their way, you would feel that way. And basically, so what Lincoln had the vision to see, his far-sighted vision. You know, this is Lincoln, who kept the Union together, who ended slavery, who gave us the first inaugural, the second inaugural. But I think his wisest, his most powerful, his most visionary moment was seeing that somehow we have to find a way to stitch these two countries together again. Giving that food was one way of doing that. Yes, ma'am.
You don't need an introduction. You do a great job introducing yourself with your material.
Oh, thank you. You're sweet.
But I have a question.
I'm going to repeat the first part. I like this lady. She said, I don't need an introduction. I do a pretty good job of introducing myself.
For years, traveling down south or being on trips and being with Southerners, the expression the War of Northern Aggression,
But they say it with a syrupy accent.
yeah, right, beautifully, the War of Northern Aggression.
Mm-hmm.
I always sensed, and I don't know if I would say the same thing today, but I always sensed still an underlying feeling from the South of unhappiness. I mean, that we, you know, it wasn't their fault, they lost, they're still unhappy, they don't love us a lot. Isn't there?
Okay, she said it's called the War of Northern Aggression in the South, or as some people put it, the recent unpleasantness. Of course, the recent unpleasantness is now a long time ago. And then she's asking, do they in the South have still unkind feelings towards the North? My sense is I think we've done a pretty good job of linking up together. And you go down South, they're regretful about much of what they did. In the majority of the quarters, it's a stain and a stench about slavery. On one hand, they want to keep their heritage and they want to remember what they had for a brief shining moment, the high water mark of the Confederacy, as it was called at Gettysburg. But on the other hand, it's clear if you go to southern cities, they want to be integrated with the modern economy, with modern culture, with modern society, compared to most of the other countries around the world. And that's the critical thing. We didn't become like a Syria. We didn't become like a Vietnam. We didn't become like an Iraq. We didn't become two hostile entities that looked wearily at each other day after day, year after year, decade after decade. And that could have happened were it not for this handful of men who rose above and beyond the hatreds of the day, above and beyond the passions of the day, and found a way to stitch us together. So that, I think, is what's most significant about this story. Yes, sir.
It seems remarkable to me that Lee would just sort of on his own decide to surrender his army. Was there communication between he and Jefferson Davis? Did he ask for permission?
Yeah, the question is it seems remarkable that Lee would make this decision on his own, and what about the communication between Lee and Jefferson Davis, for example? Well, look, in this war, it was fought on the United States territory for 2 battles, and the rest of it was fought in the South. Communication in the North was instantaneous. they had a web of Morse code, which they could kind of type out. So things moved very quickly in the north. In the south, things moved very slowly. It could take hours, or more often than not, days, if not even a week, for things to kind of percolate down into the south. And I think, look, Lee was a good soldier. He, like Grant and Sherman and the rest of so many of the other great generals, they all came out of West Point. They all believed in civilian control of the military. It would be unthinkable for them to pull the kind of monkey business, say, that people that one saw in the French Revolution. But having said that, Lee did everything he could. I mean, he wanted to win the battle. He wanted to win this war. I mean, remember who Lee was. When the Civil War was first starting, and Abraham Lincoln had to think of, okay, what am I going to do if this actually becomes a real fight? Well, who did he turn to in the beginning? He didn't turn to a man named Grant. He didn't turn to a man named Sherman. He asked Robert E. Lee, become my general-in-chief of the Union armies. And now there's a great debate and a kind of interesting discussion about, did Lee do the right thing? Well, as Lee put it, he said, I cannot raise my sword against my home country of Virginia. Now, to our lights, this may seem strange, but in that day and that age, your home state was as significant as the United States was. So it wasn't as heretical what he was saying. And he just couldn't find it in his way to do that. But then he became head of the Confederate armies, and Lee was competitive, just as Grant was competitive. My God, when they got in these battles, when they launched their men, like when they were at Gettysburg and they launched their men, this was not a sporting contest. They were doing this to break the will of the other side. But they did it on both sides. This is so fascinating for both Lincoln as well as for Lee. You know what Lincoln used to say? At one point he pointed like this. He pointed over to what is now the ancestral home of Robert E. Lee. Of course, we know it now as Arlington Cemetery. And he said, if only those people over there had behaved, then we wouldn't be in this mess. He didn't call them the enemy. He called them those people. And then Lee actually, quite by happenstance, almost all the time he said, those people, you attack those people over there. He almost never said the enemy. Interesting. Yes, sir. There's so many questions. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to... Go ahead.
Do you think we should take pride that we have learned something from Lincoln? At the end of the Second World War, MacArthur, Japan, and the Marshall Plan in Europe.
Yeah, the question is should we take some pride in what Lincoln did? And then you talked about the Marshall Plan in Europe and MacArthur in Japan and all the rest. Lincoln. I mean, how do you not take pride or pleasure in everything Lincoln did? And, remember about Lincoln for a second. I mean, Lincoln was a one-term congressman, a failed senatorial candidate twice, a man who had no military experience, a man who had no executive experience, a man who was prone to depression so great that, as he put it one day, he said, I can't even carry a penknife. I'm afraid of what I do. Was this the man to lead America in the greatest trial, the greatest threat to its integrity and the entirety of its existence? And somehow this man who suffered inwardly, who suffered outwardly, who had little real education, who had taught himself everything, he would, as I said, he would pen the first inaugural, poetry. He would pen the second inaugural, probably the finest speech ever given. He would somehow keep the United States together. If Lincoln were just about any other man, any other president, I can almost guarantee you we would be two countries today. It is hard to imagine any other president being willing to weather that storm of bloodshed and tears. I mean, so much so that even as late as 1864, this was after Gettysburg, after the great victory at Gettysburg, there was still a storm of protests throughout the North calling on Lincoln to make peace with the South. Think about that, as late as even then. And then when Grant first squared off against Lee in the Wilderness Campaign, over 6 weeks, the United States would lose some 55,000 men. That's as many as we would lose in the entirety of the Vietnam War. And it would be so terrible and so vast that Lincoln, his head down to his, like this, his hands clasped behind his back, and he'd be pacing up and down the halls of the White House saying, "My God, I must have relief from this anxiety, or it will kill me." Well, it almost did kill him, but yet somehow he persevered. So that's why Lincoln is such a great president. That's why we revere him so. He saved the country, he ended slavery, and he did so against all the odds. And it's why I think other countries have emulated him. And what we did, for example, with the Marshall Plan, it was giving the best to the countries of Western Europe. Lincoln was showing, on one hand, if you have to fight, you fight, and you fight hard. You fight with everything you've got, because Lincoln waged, in effect, what was total war, and he did it with a real tenacity. But he also had the vision to know that at a certain point, war has to become peace, and in our case, brothers had to become brothers once again. So that's why we revere him so. Yes, ma'am. To be a clairvoyant?
Abraham Lincoln finally appeared. What do you think his reaction would be to the movement to take down all the statues and change all the names?
All right, the question is what would Lincoln think about what's being done with all the statues and taking down of Confederate monuments? I'm a historian. I try to stay out of these issues. It's hard to tell. I think it's suffice to say that it's tragic, the kind of, it's completely understandable how African Americans feel when they see a number of Confederate monuments. And it's probably not inappropriate to take them down from public land and from government land and tax dollar supported land. I don't think that's a bad thing, and I don't think Lincoln would think it's a bad thing. But on the other hand, at the end of the war, Lincoln would make an appearance, and he would have some 1,000 people outside the White House who wanted to hear the great leader, the great conqueror of the South, the man who won the peace at Appomattox. They wanted to hear him say a few words. And Lincoln did that was really so interesting. He said, "Please play the song Dixie." He said it was always one of my favorite songs. So he was kind of reaching out. But it's a very complex equation. Look, I see we only have 2 more minutes, so I'm going to take 2 last questions. So raise your hand hard. Yes, sir.
Can you give the context to what Lincoln did in April, his second inaugural address in March?
Okay, the question is about the second inaugural that Lincoln gave in March. Oh God, he just talked about reconciliation and healing, and it's just beautiful, beautiful words. That's all I can say. And what he was speaking to is he was speaking to the North, but he was also speaking to the South. And he was, in effect, saying to the South, don't fight more. End this battle now. Let's get together again. I'm going to take one last question. Yes, sir. The question is it true that Horace Greeley, the great journalist from New York City, recommended Lee for the presidency? I'm not sure. Anyway, look, you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for coming, and have a great festival.